Hello, I'm Toshi Hu, Director of the Emerging Media Lab.
And I'm Anmol Chadha, the Equitable Futures Lab.
And we're going to be co-hosting the panel today. Anmol will be joining back for the second half in just a minute, but I'm going to take a moment to just introduce our panel for today. If we go to the slides, please. Thanks. Today's Urgent Futures panel is entitled Reimagining Criminal Justice as the Future of Community Safety. We're going to be bringing in two panels of experts to discuss some potentially transformative futures for our prisons and policing systems with the goal of creating more efficient, effective, and equitable outcomes. So my lab, the Emerging Media Lab, focuses on the future of human communication through the lens of media technologies. And IFTF has been forecasting around virtual reality for many years. And like many topics we've forecasted, what was once science fiction is now becoming practical reality. And we're looking deeply into how we might leverage new technologies like VR for transformative uses. Another way to think about virtual and augmented reality is as experiential media, and particularly how this can be used for experiential learning. Of course, most learning is based on experience, either our own direct experience or experiences of others, which we communicate through various mediums. So we've been looking at a variety of signals for how VR can be used for learning and education. We've attended lectures from Oxford University on endangered Malaysian wildcats with virtual animals walking around the lecture hall. We've visited companies training forklift operators in VR forklift training systems. You can attend a lecture with Neil deGrasse Tyson in a virtual lecture hall, or your classroom can be on the surface of Mars. But one of the major transformational aspects of VR is that it's an embodied experience. So when you step into VR, you feel like you're actually there. Like this experience, which is called walking the plank, where you experience walking out of a 70-story building. And even though you know it's not real and you're safe in a room somewhere, it's still quite terrifying. And many people are not able to walk out onto that 6-foot plank. The simulation is that realistic that for our bodies. And this kind of realistic embodied experience has many applications for training and preparing people for real-world situations. There's welding simulators, there's surgical simulators. You can train for soft skills like public speaking. And for higher stakes situations like policing, the decisions you make in the heat of the moment can literally mean life or death. So some police are training for situations ranging from traffic stops to active shooter situations in VR, where you can practice as many times as you need to be able to prepare for in a low stakes environment before lives might be on the line. And our lab was particularly intrigued by this signal we found of a prison in Colorado using VR to help prepare prisoners for being released from prison for the big changes as they return to the outside world after years of incarceration. Things that are normal for many of us, like using a self-checkout at a grocery store, are quite overwhelming for someone who's never experienced it. So earlier this year, IFTF partnered with Alameda County Probation Department here in the Bay Area to develop a 2-year project to pilot the use of virtual reality to assist the reentry process for individuals making this transition from prison back to the outside world. Now, we don't just see this as a technology project. This is very much a futures project. We see this project as an opportunity to look at the future of institutions like prison systems. And this is also looking at personal futures for the individuals being released. How can VR be used to help themselves think about their own personal futures? And this is also looking at the better futures for communities, because we know that incarceration and separation from families has major impacts on the wider community and the future of that community. So this is all very intersectional. And if the current pandemic is teaching us anything, we're learning that all of our futures are deeply intertwined with one another. And as we're seeing with the Black Lives Movement, there's widespread calls right now for change within our criminal justice system. Some are calling for things like defund the police or invest in communities. But what would those futures actually look like? Now, as these calls for defunding the police came up, there were some memes that caught my eye as a futurist. There's a group called Conflict Transformation. They created a collection of posters, provocations really, to reimagine the meaning of public safety. The posters ask us to imagine what other responses we might have to community members in need other than an armed police officer. So how might we address issues like mental illness or homelessness or drug addiction in ways that actually lead to safety both for the individuals and the community at large? check the chat for a link to see those posters yourself. So that leads us today to our panel, Reimagining Criminal Justice as the Future of Community Safety. I'm going to be hosting part one, and I'm going to introduce our first two panelists up. Our first panelist is our partner, Chief Wendy Still, who's the Chief Probation Officer of Alameda County Probation Department. And then in a moment, we'll introduce Dr. Christine Montross, who's a psychiatrist and author, and we'll be chatting with both of them. So if we could bring in Chief Still. Hi, okay, welcome Chief Still. Thanks for joining us today. So Chief, I know ACPD is quite unique in that your organization has actually engaged with a futurist to develop a 10-year forecast for your organization and a strategic plan. Can you talk about what that means for an organization like Alameda County Probation Department to make a 10-year strategic plan?
What it means is really transforming the whole organization to prepare for it, looking ahead, and that's based upon the 30 years that I spent working in the prison system before I came out to the community. And so knowing that we had such poor results relative to recidivism, right? I wanted to prepare an agency that was the 21st century probation department. What that meant was looking internally, creating a body of knowledge, dealing with organizational change, readying everyone to look to the future, beginning to have conversations about not just what is today, but what is tomorrow, and how can we use technology, and what changes do we need to make as an organization in order to prepare for that. So those were all preparatory things that we had to really do. And in looking to the future in 10 years, we also created a 5-year strategic plan that was aligned with our 10-year vision that included also objectives. So we were actually not only looking to the future, but we were actively working on moving to that future that we envisioned. So it's quite different for government agency to really think that hard about the future and behave about it, but change is so much a part of our world now, and certainly criminal justice, which we're the #1 incarcerator in the world. So obviously change has to come. And so it's really preparing our organization and our community for that change. And all of this happened before, of course, the most recent, really intense Black Lives Matter, because of the tragic events that have occurred. And so I feel really fortunate, because part of our looking to the future was dealing with the racial and ethnic disparities that exist within the population that we serve. Probably criminal justice is one of the most prime area for complete redesigning how we think about what justice means, right? And justice means thinking about also what we do in the schools as much as what we do in the prisons, right? And creating those bridges and the prevention. And so it's much, much more about how do you do probation, right? It's looking at the larger context and preparing for that. So that's the journey that we've been on for the last 5 years, and will continue to. And the state's making some big changes about our juvenile will no longer go off to juvenile prison. We will be housing them. So those are the type of massive changes that are occurring, why it's so important for us to ready for the future and incorporate technology and different learning and experiences to prepare for that, and also create bridges. So it's not prison or probation, community, it's how do we work together towards that smooth transition.
Thanks, Chief Still. So glad you're here today. IFTF has a long history of working with government agencies, and it's a big part of our mission to be investing in civic futures. So we're really excited about our partnered project with you. I want to introduce our second panelist right now, Dr. Christine Montross. Christine's recent book, Waiting for an Echo, The Madness of American Incarceration, explores not only the psychological impact of American prisons, but also does a fascinating dive into some of the alternative approaches Finland is taking with its prison system and the very different outcomes they're finding. Hello, Christine. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Toshi. I'm really happy to be here.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the psychological challenges that individuals face when reentering from prison? What makes it hard for them to create better futures for themselves after incarceration?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we as a society don't fully understand, and I didn't fully understand before I researched my book, is that 95% of people who are incarcerated are released from prison back into our communities. So it's such an important question that you ask. And I came to this question as a psychiatrist who treats inpatient hospitalized folks with severe mental illness. And I would often see them in my hospital after periods of incarceration. And I would see that they had served time in prison, often for their symptoms, not necessarily for any kind of criminal intent. But regardless of why they ended up in prison, almost to a person, the prison environment had made their symptoms worse. And symptomatology in general of severe mental illness makes it difficult for people to adhere to the requirements of probation and parole that I'm sure Chief Still can speak to. When someone is dealing with symptoms of severe mental illness, so they're hearing voices or seeing visions, or they are feeling grandiose, like they have delusions that no one can harm them, that they have superpowers, they are less able to comply with the expectations that are set forth by our law enforcement. And if someone can't meet the requirements for their probation or parole, as Chief Still will tell you, they get sent right back to jail or prison. So it can be a really vicious cycle for people with mental illness. Most importantly, I think one of the things that we have to reckon with is that correctional practices themselves are really dehumanizing and degrading by design. We intend for people to suffer while they're in prison. And so people are often worse when they emerge. And then there are obstacles to reintegrating in our communities. So perhaps they have not had the substance abuse treatment that they needed in jail or prison. Perhaps they're entering back into a community and friend groups that have all kinds of triggers that trigger those urges to use that we know are deep wired in the brain. Or the most stark examples I saw were people who were released directly from solitary confinement to the streets, directly from solitary confinement to their communities. And you can imagine when someone's been isolated without any kind of sensory input and then is suddenly thrown back into full-on community living, it poses a lot of psychological challenges. So there are a number of ways in which mental health is a real question to interrogate at that moment of transition that the Chief was talking about, the bridge from the correctional practice to the community.
Thanks, Christine. I'd like to invite Chief Still to join us again so we can all have a short discussion as well. But, you know, it's interesting. This is an urgent future. And one of the interesting outcomes of this current quarantine and pandemic is that we've seen more people realize how urgent a problem this is. So I think we could talk for quite a while around all the problems that there are. But what I want to start off with right now is, you know, at IFTF, we have a practice of looking for what we call signals, which are small examples or indicators of how things might be different in the future. What are some examples of different models of incarceration that you've seen happening either in the United States or internationally? Chief Still, maybe you could start us off.
Sure. Well, I had the opportunity last year before the pandemic to go to Norway with a contingent of legislators, senators, assembly persons, people from the governor's office here in California, myself and a few other justice leaders, to look at a different model, right? The Norway model. And what that model does is the prison system recognizes that the whole experience of an inmate in prison directly relates to their success or failure when they return home to the community, right? And the prison system's whole mission is to return home better neighbors, right? It's not about punishment. The punishment is that individual is taken out of the community, and then the prison's job basically is to return home a better neighbor. So when you go inside the prisons themselves, the experience, you know, the choices that the individuals have, the inmates, the actual security, how they maintain security, it's a very humanizing experience. Our prisons are very dehumanizing, as was previously mentioned. And so I think that, you know, the transformation of the culture just inside of our prisons is going to be critical to the future. And I think we're starting to see signals of that, you know, and what we're working on relative to Alameda County is that we've been working for a year and a half on creating that bridge. And we're using technology. This was way before the pandemic, and we're Skyping in and we're talking to our clients that will be coming home. And part of the change is also changing language. They're clients. They're not probationers. They're not PRCSs. They're not parolees, right? They're clients that our job is here to help. So transforming our culture of our workforce to understand that, but Skyping in, allowing the individual inmate to be part of their program to help drive that. Because if it's going to be successful, they have to participate in that. But then also creating VR opportunities for training of them to have those experiences, because many have been out of the community for a very long time. But also bridging in and doing reentry plans. And then what we already know, because we're already researching it, that just that little change in and of itself increased our report rates by about 30%, right? And so we also are hiring individuals that are released. It's something very different that I think is a signal. We created a new classification within our county, and I hired someone that was on parole that had been doing 19 years, 2 months after he was released. You know, before there has always been a concrete barrier. You do not hire any felons, right, in these criminal justice agencies because of there can be X type of problems. But now we're hiring individuals that are, have done 19, 20, and the next individual I'm in the process of hiring 25 years. So we're bringing that experience inside our organization. I think that is an absolute culture signal and a change of attitude. And we're not the only ones that are beginning to do this. And so I think that there's a realization that we need to rehumanize not only the experience inside, but also outside, and break down the barriers, which there are so many. Like was mentioned, the previous parole requirements, and there used to automatically be, it's so easy to violate your probation or your parole and get sent back, whether it's to do a 6-month violation term or back to state prison, where now the energy is being put towards how to provide the wraparound services so the individual can be successful. Even in jail, creating pretrial programs to basically keep individuals out of jail while they go through the criminal justice, the legal proceedings. That's a huge signal, a big push on the November ballot, SB 10, right? Whether or not every jails or every county is going to be required to have a pretrial system. All of those are signals that change is needed in the justice system.
Yeah, to your point about employment after incarceration, one of the biggest challenges of people having records, an incredible intersection of a lot of urgent futures, the pandemic, the wildfires, and our mass incarceration. With the wildfires in California, we've been using prison labor, sometimes paying them $5 a day to fight these wildfires. And due to the coronavirus, there's been a loss of availability of that cheap labor. But the other good news is that this week, our governor just passed into law a bill that said that now people who have been a firefighter as a prisoner can now actually become a firefighter afterwards, kind of creating that learnings from their experience and bring that into their life afterwards. Christine, I want to bring you into this conversation just because Chief brought up Norway, and I misspoke when I said Finland with your book. Your book is about Norway. I wonder if you could just share a little bit about some of the interesting things you learned on your research into the Norwegian prison systems.
Yeah. So I suspect the Chief and I visited some of the same places, and I visited Sweden as well. And one of the things that makes it so salient for this conversation is that, as I'm sure the Chief saw too, the focus in Scandinavia on incarceration is toward the future at all times. So they are saying the one thing we cannot change is the past. We can't change the crime that was committed. We can't change what it was that brought you to this point. But instead of using this sentence as doing time, as we really do in America, let's use that time constructively with an eye on the future, as the Chief said, to make you a better neighbor. So what does that mean, to be a better neighbor? What that means is when you leave prison, we don't want you to come back. We want you to go out. We want you to get a job. We want you to be a tax-paying member of society. We want you to be a part of your community. And we don't want you to return to prison. So then every element of the time incarcerated is really focused on those aims. And one of the things when I was writing, Waiting for an Echo, that became one of the central questions of the book for me was, what does it mean to be a better neighbor? What does it mean to be a part of your community? And we don't want you to return to prison. So then every element of the time incarcerated is really focused on those aims. And one of the things when I was writing Waiting for an Echo that became one of the central questions of the book for me was, what are our aims as a country? What is the future we're working toward when we incarcerate people? At the moment, I really believe that our core aims are that we want people to suffer when they are incarcerated. We want vengeance. We say we want safety and justice, but our practices do not reduce recidivism rates. They don't make our communities safer. They don't shore up people and rehabilitate them. In fact, quite the opposite. And yet we cling to our current practices because the idea of human restorative rehabilitative practices feels somehow too soft for us, that we feel as though if someone's done something wrong, they deserve punishment and they should be locked up and undergo something unpleasant. The Scandinavian focus says, okay, but that doesn't work. So really, what are your aims? And if you look to what you want 5, 10, 15 years in the future when people come out, 6 months, 2 years in the future when people come out, what are the measures we can take now that prevent the outcomes we don't want and solidify the outcomes that we do? So those countries do what's called a needs assessment at the beginning of a period of incarceration, where they look closely at the factors in a person's life that led them to commit crimes. And then they look at each of those factors as things that can be mitigated through the duration of the prison stay. So if you're someone with mental health issues, you get mental health treatment. If you're someone with addiction issues, you have substance abuse treatment. If you need education, that's a priority when you're in prison. If you need job skills training, that's a priority. And the aim at all times is really on forward motion to achieve those gains of lower recidivism, higher safety for the communities.
Absolutely. You know, one of the interesting things about prison reform is that it has fairly wide bipartisan support, even in a moment where the country is so divided. But I'm curious, you know, with these recent calls for things like hashtag defund the police, I mean, what does that mean for, you know, the work that you do, Chief Still? Does that help move forward what you want to do, or is it difficult? What would be the best possible futures that defund the police, or that the sentiment behind that would be?
Well, I think there needs to be a recognition and a redefinition of who does what, right? And it's not completely defund the police, right? Because we do need to have a police force, but we also need to balance that with investing in the communities. I call the broken communities, right? Because we haven't made those investments in the schools in these communities, in the individuals, the families, even the parks and the whole social system within, right? And so I think that's really, if we're going to have a bright future, that's where we end up at, right? Is less investment in jail and incarceration and prison. Those are investments in failures. Investments in success in the future is going to be investing in those communities that have been left behind. And you can see by who's in our prisons and jails and on probation, the disparity, the racial and ethnic disparity of that, right? So, and I think that that's what the call for defunding the police is all about. I think there is a realization we have to have some form of police, right? And some form of prison or jail, because, you know, with some of the most horrific crimes we have, right, that's the answer. But that's not the majority of the answer. As you said, 95%, you know, of those that are in prison are coming home. And so, but the kind of investments that we make, you know, we need to revisit, you know, basically how we're making those investments accordingly. One thing I'm concerned about, right, is that we don't, because there is a realization about money and funding. And so the identity, some of the police and sheriff and that, they're trying to change their identity to be out, and community policing is the new tag, right? I mean, it's been around, but now there's kind of a resurgence in it. And all that really is paying for a high dollar amount of what we should be investing in community organizations, right? That are in the communities, that will be in the communities and strengthen that, versus expanding our police force, which ultimately all that will do is widen the net if we engage them in the community policing tag. So I would say that that's a future danger that we need to look out for. You know, there used to be the prison industrial complex, right? Well, there is a risk that if we don't get this right, you know, that we're just going to end up with that kind of a police force out in the community. So anyways, those are my thoughts.
Thank you. You know, at IFTF, we have a phrase, looking back to look forward, and trying to draw from the lessons of the past. Christine, when we spoke about this topic of defund the police, you had some interesting lessons learned from the past. I wonder if you could share some of those.
Sure. My thoughts immediately go back to the deinstitutionalization movement in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. This is when severely mentally ill people who were held in our state psychiatric hospitals were released after the Community Mental Health Centers Act was passed. And the idea was that these hospitals, which were, in fairness, in that era, quite draconian places. So the impulse behind this was a really well-intentioned impulse. But the idea was that people would move from these state hospitals into the community, where their care would be absorbed in the community and they would receive their treatment there. What happened, I think, is a cautionary tale because the funding that was promised for the community mental health centers never materialized. And this is really where the idea of the criminalization of mental illness, in my mind, begins. That you have severely mentally ill people who were released from our state hospitals, but the treatment that they required, the housing they were receiving, the food that they were receiving, never was offered to them in the communities. And so suddenly you had people begging on the streets and sleeping in doors of public spaces. And those people suddenly shifted from the auspices of healthcare into the auspices of law enforcement. And I think that is a cautionary tale. As we talk about defunding the police or shifting funds, we need to really make sure that the delivery is there. When we talk about shifting funds to what the philosopher Martha Nussbaum would call ex-ante approaches, solutions that are really preventive measures, I think that makes such good sense. We have to make sure that our legislators deliver on those promises. And I think then the other central question that arises for me as someone who's concerned about the intersection of mental health and police is that mentally ill people are 16 times more likely to be killed by police than mentally well people. This is a critical issue that we've seen even in recent days with Daniel Prude, with the shooting of someone in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, whose family called for help. And this is what happens when the resources available to people in psychiatric emergencies are law enforcement resources. And I think a central question that we need to ask ourselves is, where do psychiatric emergencies belong? Do they belong under the realm of the police? And I would argue they don't. They're healthcare emergencies. So just as we have EMTs that show up when you're having a stroke or when you're having a heart attack, we ought to have trained clinicians that can intervene in the healthcare emergency that is a psychiatric emergency, that is not requiring law enforcement agents to do something that they're less trained in, and also that can be dangerous. But in fact, healthcare providers that can provide a healthcare response in these moments of mental health crises.
Thank you. Well, that wraps it up for part one. I want to thank Chief Still for joining us. Follow along on IFTF's website to learn more about our VR reentry project over the next year. I want to thank Dr. Christine Montross. Please check out her book. And also there's an excellent interview in Fresh Air podcast with Christine about the Norwegian prisons, if you would like to learn more about that. I think we're going to post that in the chat in a moment. And that wraps it up for part one. I'm going to hand this over now to my colleague, Ann Malchada, Director of the Equitable Futures Lab, to moderate the second half of our panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Chief Still. Thank you, Toshi.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Toshi, for that wonderful conversation. I think it was a fascinating look at really reimagining the individual experiences within the criminal justice system. And I think now we want to zoom out a bit and look a little bit more at the systems level. And as Toshi mentioned, this year we've seen really remarkable stretch of social unrest, calls for a movement for racial justice, a broader social reckoning, especially focused on the criminal justice system. And my guests today on this panel are two of the most brilliant thinkers and doers in this space who are going to help us unpack this and make sense of it. We have Purvi Shah from the Movement Law Lab and Marbury Stolly Butts from Law for Black Lives. So welcome both Purvi and Marbury.
Thank you for having us. It's great to be here.
And Marbury, let's start with you. This came up in the last session, in the last segment as well, around calls for defunding the police. This is one of the calls that's gotten the most attention this year in these ongoing social movements. what does that mean? What does defunding the police mean to you? And beyond that, what's the alternative vision that you have?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. You know, my mom always asks me this. She's like, do you really mean defund? Like, don't you mean reimagine or rethink? And I always say, no, we mean defund. And I think that this call comes out of a long, long history of asking for less resources to be put towards what is really kind of a violent force in Black, brown, and poor communities. And so I think, number one, understanding that throughout history, whether it's the origins of the police in slave catchers and in Union suppression here in the North, that there's a long history of police being occupiers in Black and brown communities. And there's a general, I think, knowledge that police actually don't keep us safe in our communities. And not only are they the purveyors of violence, that according to a Malcolm X grassroots report, every 28 hours, the police kill an unarmed Black man or Black person in this country, but they also don't actually keep us safe in other ways, right? And so we know that most of violent crimes go unsolved, most rapes go unsolved. And so I think when we say defund the police, we don't just mean defund in terms of money. We also mean defund legitimacy, defund faith and dependence on the police. So we have to start thinking of other ways to keep ourselves safe. And the reality is that across the country, over $100 billion is invested every single year in policing. And that's money that could be invested in things like transportation, in healthcare, in education, in employment, in things that folks really need to actually feel safe. And so I think the call for defund means, number one, to cut the budgets. So we're seeing places like Oakland spend more than half of their general funds on policing at the expense of things like healthcare, like childcare, like education. And so the call really is to, number one, cut the amount of money that's being spent, but also to rethink what safety is. And so we often say that if you go to the Hamptons or other affluent white neighborhoods, abolition's already happened, right? The police do not respond to things like drug abuse or even conflict by coming to folks' houses and shooting it up, right? That instead there are other ways, other investments in society that make us safe. And I think whenever we ask folks to kind of close their eyes and imagine safety, nobody ever says, oh, police and jail cells and cages make me safe. That we all know instinctively that actually houses, healthcare, family, love, support, all what makes us safe. And so I think the call for defund is not a reactionary call. There has been literally generations of work around thinking through what actually keeps us safe. And the answer for Black and brown people is just not the police. And so I think what it looks like is deep, deep investments in healthcare, in education, in housing. It looks like us hoarding each other. And the reality is that most of the things we use the police for are low quality of life offenses. And I say quality of life in that they make middle-class, often white folks feel uncomfortable. And that is what most arrests actually are for. It's for turnstile hopping, it's for loitering. And so the reality is that a major investment in things like housing infrastructure, in things like healthcare, will solve most of the issues that police respond to. The deep issues of harm will require a lot more kind of work and transformation. And that is work that movement has already started to do, but it requires a deep investment in people, an idea that they're not disposable, and a willingness to think about how do we actually address the underlying root causes as opposed to just be reactionary with violence. And so I think the defund movement, which has been kind of underground for literally a decade, is now coming to the forefront and demands of us a bit more imagination, but also a reinvestment of funds from what has been a real violent kind of intervention in Black and brown communities to ones that actually build up our communities.
Great, thanks. And Puri, I'd like to invite you to add to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I would want to add, and Marbury, I think so beautifully put, I think the political grounding and the practical grounding of the defund the police demand. The thing that I want to add to that is that I think that this is a deeply thoughtful demand. I think that there is sort of a sentiment that this is unrealistic or improbable or impossible. And I think that it really comes out of longstanding attempts to reform policing, to reform our criminal justice system. We've had endless data. We've had tons of studies. We've watched horrific video after horrific video. We've talked about, is it a single officer or is it the system? And what we, I think, have to come to or face or confront as a truth is that the system is failing. We're in a wholesale system failure when it comes to policing and to our criminal injustice system. And so I think inside that, grounding this call that is historic. It's not sort of a knee-jerk reaction of young people that are pissed off right now. It is grounded in a historical understanding of the underpinnings of the criminal justice system, but also the moment that we're in. I think you can't understand a demand if you don't understand the moment that we're in. And with this moment being the largest moment of unrest in the history of the United States tells us, right? We've had an unprecedented amount of people of all different backgrounds coming out saying something has to give. And so I think that's where this demand, for me, I think that's how I understand this demand. I also understand it inside the contradiction of so many systems that are failing. Our public health systems are failing. Our education systems are not adapting. Our labor, how we value work and who gets paid and who has to go to work and who, the sort of images of immigrant laborers in the farms working in under orange skies. I mean, I think we're in a moment where no matter how painful it feels, it is time to reimagine a range of systems that are the underpinnings of our economy, of our politics in this country.
That's great. And Purvi, you mentioned this, that you make this point that these are very long-standing issues, right? While this may have sparked up to many people this year, they've seen it on the news maybe for the first time, or it's very newsworthy now. These have been recurring issues for a very long time, and I think one thing that strikes me, and I'll take this to Marbury, is that the criminal justice system has shown itself to be remarkably resilient, right, and in many ways very resistant to reform. Whether it's this year with George Floyd, a few years ago we had Philando Castile, we can go farther back, we can go back to Rodney King in 1992. Before that, we can go to Watts in the late 60s, and then beyond and beyond and beyond. And periodically we see these efforts come up time and time again. And I'm wondering what, in your mind, have been the biggest obstacles to reform in the criminal justice system, and what do we need to overcome that?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And I think part of the reason why it's been so difficult to reform is because it actually is working exactly how it's supposed to. That this system really was built on the kind of aftermath and on the ashes of slavery. It was meant to control and coerce Black and Brown communities. And so what is needed is not a reform, not a tweaking at the edges, but actually a transformation of not just the kind of the actual mechanisms of the system, but also the objectives of the system. And so I think very often we talk about the system as if there's something just wrong with it, or it's just a little bit broken. And the reality is that since its inception, whether it's policing that, as I mentioned before, really began with slave patrols in the South, it began with the suppression of unions in the North, whether it's incarceration on a mass scale that started after slavery with the 13th Amendment, that these are systems that have rotten roots. And so what is necessary is not just a reimagining, but actually a complete and total transformation. And so I think as long as we try and kind of tinker at the edges, we find ourselves re-entrenching it, right? And so we saw 5 years ago after the killing of Michael Brown and other folks, and again, these killings happen every single day, but after the kind of media moment of Michael Brown, that there was a call for body cameras, which actually invested more money into these systems. And so I think as long as we try to kind of tinker at the edges, we are destined to recreate and re-entrench them. And so what I think is really possible at this moment is that people are kind of seeing the emperor has no clothes on, that not only are these systems incredibly violent, and we see that now on videotape after videotape after videotape of our people being killed, but also what they purport to do, they don't actually do. They don't actually keep us safe. And so we know, for instance, that 95% of the NYPD time is spent kind of solving minor crimes, but 85% of homicides go unsolved in Brooklyn, New York, right? So the reality is that the system that we have not only doesn't work to do what it purports to do, but it actually is working all along to kind of do what it actually was meant to do, which is to really to interrupt and destruct Black and Brown communities and to coerce and control them. And so I think what's different at this moment is just the amount of energy and movement around this demand. And again, I think, as Purvi said, there's been a generation. There was Care Not Cages in the 80s. There was Cops Not Councils in the 90s. We've seen organizers really inform and instigate communities around this demand of like, what actually keeps you safe, right? And the answer is not police, it's not guns, it's not more violence. It's how do we build the infrastructure and to Purvi's point, build up all the other failing systems to actually address what folks need, which leads to lack of safety. So I think what has to happen, one, is a recognition that these systems are not incidentally racist, they are inherently racist. So we have to reckon with that reality. And once we do, we have to also recognize that we can't rebuild them in the same image. They have to be actually transformed. And that's scary. It requires, we never live under a different system, right? So it's a whole new kind of imagination of what is possible, but it's necessary at this moment. And I think that it requires from us some courage in thinking about what actually is possible and investing in young folks who I think really are leading the way in terms of imagining what that could look like and are building that as we speak. So Critical Resistance and Generation 5 and these organizations who are dealing with hard questions of deep harm and trauma and transformational justice. And how do we actually follow their lead in this moment, I think is a really important question for us.
Yeah. Purvi, what about you? What do you think? What's different about this moment? I think, and I'll say briefly, I think that something seems different this year, right? I think beyond, I mean, you mentioned the scale of the uprisings and the scale of what's going on and how has stayed in the news for a very long time. There was also, there was a week, right, where on email every day we were getting statements from all sorts from Netflix, right, from Snapchat or whoever else about standing with Black lives. What is different about this moment there? And what do you see the role of these actors in, I guess, in bringing about these urgent social changes? Is there a role, and where should the focus of this work be?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're dealing with the wound of racism and the wound of slavery in this country. And I think, we've had in the last 6 years, 2 incredibly powerful moments of racial justice, went from the Ferguson moment to the present. And I think what we're seeing is both like, this is no longer a conversation that is sort of quietly had at the kitchen table. This is a conversation that we have to have in every single space that we're in. And ultimately, when your question is, why have we been having this conversation about mass incarceration or the criminal justice system, and why haven't we actually made those changes? Ultimately, it comes down to power. We have a problem of people who are powerful and who make decisions in our society are not the people most proximate to problems. Abolition is something that is born out of communities that have lived with deep proximity to the horror, the horror of the criminal injustice system, right? And so I think we have to kind of both think about this as power. We can have a demand, but we have to have enough power to win these demands. And I think this is also the brilliance of the movement for Black Lives, which is both putting out visionary demands and building the power. And so I think there are so many people who study the criminal justice system, who think about it, who write about it. Where are we centering the voices of people that are most impacted by these systems? Where are we coming up with solutions that are born out of experience? And I think, look, Marbury and I have been friends for a long time, and we've had debates amongst ourselves about how do we really practice abolition, right? And I think that I think listening to Black women leaders, listening to people who are in families that have been impacted by incarceration, I think there is a different level of nuance. And it's as Brian Stevenson says, people who are most proximate to problems oftentimes have the best solutions to them. So I think it's about power. I think it's about investing and building the power, listening to the leadership of people that are impacted, and actually changing, from the top to the bottom. Who are our district attorneys? Who are our local elected officials? Who's actually whose experiences are deemed worthy and valid in terms of making public policy.
Yeah, so it sounds like it's what you're saying is in some ways is that it's not enough. It's necessary, but not enough to just have the ideas or to have the alternative visions or to just have the conversations, right? That we actually need to be building that power, that political power and the social power to actually implement those visions and to put those ideas into action. Puri, I also wanted to stick with you for a second. You mentioned this earlier very briefly. I know you take in your role with the Movement Law Lab, you take a more expansive vision of the law, right, and of these different systems, how they work together. Can you talk about that a little bit more, draw that out a little bit beyond? I mean, we're focused very much on the criminal justice system. You mentioned a few other things as well that are intersecting. I want to give you a moment to speak on that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, Marbury sort of pointed at the idea that our system's broken, or are they working actually perfectly? And I think we have to take a step back and look at the legal system as a whole, right? I think the sort of normative or hegemonic thought about law is that law is a guarantor of a just society, of equality, of fairness. But when we look historically, law has justified slavery, law has justified torture, internment, war. And so there is a question of how is law being wielded in our society? And I think historically, if we look back, law has been a tool of the powerful. It has helped architect our existing status quo. It's helped architect oppression in many ways. I think the invitation and the question is, how might we be able to think about law as a building block of equality, of freedom, of a new sort of way of being, right? And I think there are two sort of truths, or there are a couple of mythology about the law, but also truth that we have to speak about the law. One, this idea that law is not just neutral, objective, or fair, right? That law is really a malleable tool that is wielded by whosever hands it is in. Second, I think when we look at moments like this, we have to think about the legal profession as a whole. How does it show up? We conceptually think about lawyers as being, the sort of protectors of truth or fairness. But the reality is that only 3% of American lawyers work on issues of justice and poverty. So I think the legal profession, right, which lawyers are all up and down these systems, that we have a crisis of leadership, of culture, and values in the legal system. It's not so much that we're sitting on the sidelines of injustice. It is that 97% of lawyers are literally the private sort of, cadre for elites, for corporations, and for the carceral system, right? And so I think that we really have a moment in which, when we look at the kind of scale of crisis we're in, whether it's mass incarceration or civil unrest, or 40 million people slated for eviction, 30 million people that are facing unemployment, we have wide scale system failure. And those small percentage of lawyers that are supposed to be advancing social justice, we're outnumbered in an incredible amount. And so I think we have to rethink the way lawyers work towards systemic change. Most of us are patching up people in a revolving door of crisis. Sometimes you have a right to a lawyer. In the criminal justice system, you do. Most civil issues, people approach lawyers for 30% of their problems and are denied assistance 86% of the time. So we just have a major justice challenge going on. So I think when we think about reimagining law, to me, it's like there's been a whole bunch of conversation around technology, automation, ways that we can sort of increase the efficiency of a lawyer and a client relationship. But personally, I think that's not the right problem to be solving for. The real question is, how are lawyers working on systemic change? How are we partnering with leaders in our communities? How are we actually understanding a collaborative, interdisciplinary way of approaching complex social problems, in which law is not the sort of engine of transformation? Social movements have been the engine of transformation. So to me, when I think about reimagining sort of how we as a sector engage in social change work, it really changes, like, what is our theory of how change happens? And for me, and for a lot of lawyers that I think have studied history, we say that when you look at intractable social problems, they're transformed through social movements. And so then how do lawyers join into those movements and work to sort of protect, defend, and bolster the sort of transformative potential of social movements?
That's great. And this is a question I want to kick to Marbury. So, it's sometimes said that there are no facts about the future, or that it's impossible to predict what the future looks like. I think one thing that we do know about the future for certain, though, at least in the United States, is that in just about 20 years, the United States is going to be majority people of color. And that's, I think all of our visions of the future need to be informed by that. And the question for you, if we're focusing and thinking about criminal justice today, what does the criminal justice system look like in that context? What does it look like if it continues unreformed with a majority people of color society?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think it's important what Poppy also said about how the law has been used and utilized. That for so long and historically, the law really is a weapon of the elite and to encourage the status quo. And so whether it's apartheid South Africa, we have seen over and over again the law be used by a minority of people to control a majority. And so I think there's no guarantee of justice because of how we see the demographics in this country change. And even James Forman Jr. wrote a book about kind of DC and how often Black folks are also recruited to enforce what is racist and systemically racist and unfair laws against other Black folks. And so there's no guarantee even having a Black face or a brown face in charge or in a position of power doesn't change the systems we're inside of. And so I think this idea of system failure, along with kind of system success, that if you want justice, these are system failures. If you actually are looking for what these systems were meant to propagate, they are successful. It's so important. And that our fight is not one for individuals to be in places of power, but instead to actually see these entire systems be transformed. And so I think this idea of how do we actually have a system that serves the most people, that often we say kind of if all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. And so I think we think about law reform as the most important kind of tool we have, but actually the organizing work that's happening, the way folks are addressing harm outside of the system completely, the way that we are funding and supporting alternatives to incarceration, but also to policing, also to how do we actually deal with kind of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, domestic violence, things that happen inside of folks' homes, and actually go largely unaddressed by our current system is so, I think, essential. And so I think we shouldn't assume, just because there'll be a majority of people of color in this country, that we will be any closer to justice. That for so long, we've seen across the globe that the law has been utilized as a weapon and a tool against minority populations as well as majority. And so I think all work of reimagining what justice looks like for everybody is so, so essential in this moment. I think the economic piece of that is also important, that as Poppy said, there are many different systems at play, and capitalism is incredibly important to criminal injustice, right? That it is one of the many ways that this system is propagated is by the ways in which fees and fines are levied, the ways in which police work overtime, the ways in which we continue to fund police at rates that are at the kind of expense of things like universal basic income. And so putting together kind of all the pieces of the puzzle, I think, is really essential, and not assuming that justice will come with the majority of the population being people of color.
Great, thank you. And it looks like, we are very tight on time, so we're going to have to get here, but this has been a tremendous conversation. I think I want to thank both the panelists today, especially for the work that you're doing and also for joining us on the panel today. So thank you both, Purvi and Marbury. And again, this conversation from the beginning with Toshi and Dr. Montross and Chief Still, we've covered a lot of ground here, from virtual reality to models of recidivism and the approaches to criminal justice system in Norway and Scandinavian models, the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is all part of a conversation around reimagining criminal justice and the law. And again, as we mentioned today, not just having that conversation, not just continuing this conversation, but going really well beyond that and building the power for action to bring about the change that we need. So thank you guys both for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.